In the industrial town of Ember Hollow, Pennsylvania, the year was 1872. The town didn't breathe, it wheezed, covered in coal dust and soaked in the toxic runoff from nearby steel mills. Ember Hollow was more a machine than a town. Every street was a gear, every building a cog, and in the center of this grinding, gasping system lived Miriam and Elsie Candle, two sisters destined for a history no one could have imagined. They were only children when they were orphaned. Their father, Samuel Candle, worked in the iron forge on the edge of town. Their mother, Ruth, stitched uniforms for soldiers, her hands raw and bleeding in the dim light of a windowless warehouse. One stormy night, a fire broke out at the forge. Reports said it was caused by faulty machinery that hadn't been repaired in months. Samuel never came out. Ruth died 2 weeks later, coughing soot and grief. No compensation, no justice, just silence. Miriam was 12, Elsie 10. The town quickly forgot the Candles. Ember Hollow moved on. It always did. No time for mourning. The sisters were taken in by an elderly aunt who could barely feed herself, let alone two hungry children. By the age of 11, Elsie was sorting coal beside men with no fingers. Miriam, a child with a sharp mind and a hunger for knowledge, swept the floor of a textile mill, where she memorized the machine's rhythm like lullabies sung by giants. But there was something about the Candle sisters that set them apart. They had an unusual resilience. They never begged, never stole, never cursed the world aloud, even when it clearly deserved it. At night, they would sit on a wooden crate outside their shack, with a single candle flickering between them. There, Miriam would read from a tattered book salvaged from a church fire. She taught Elsie to read not just words, but the meaning behind them. They read about people who stood for something, about revolutions, about justice, about God's light in a godless world. Their candle became symbolic in the neighborhood. When someone fell ill or lost a family member to the factory, the sisters would appear at the door with their flickering light, some hot soup, and a listening ear. Their presence, however young, offered something that the town had lost: compassion. But compassion was not the kind of power Ember Hollow valued, not yet. By the time Miriam was 16 and Elsie was 14, the sisters had seen more death than most old men: crushed limbs, burned bodies, suicide notes left behind machines that took more than just fingers. They took hope. Yet the sisters didn't grow bitter. They grew brave. They started writing letters to the mayor, to factory owners, to church leaders. They were dismissed every time. Girls shouldn't meddle in men's affairs. They were told, "Be grateful you have jobs." But the sisters knew the truth. The jobs were death sentences with paychecks. Miriam began secretly documenting conditions at the textile factory: injuries, overtime violations, and unsafe practices. Elsie collected testimonies from young girls beaten for slowing down or fainting. They planned to share this truth one day, not for vengeance, but for change. But truth in a place built on lies is dangerous. The factory owners caught wind of their resistance. The Candle sisters were labeled troublemakers. Warnings were issued. Men followed them home at night. Their aunt begged them to stop, but the fire inside them had already been lit. It wasn't rebellion, it was righteousness. They believed if they said nothing, they were as guilty as those who let children die for profit. The candle still burned every night between them. Their fire, born in silence, would soon roar. But it wouldn't be the kind of fire they hoped to spark. The flame meant to bring warmth and awareness would become a blaze that changed history, and took them with it. And yet, even today, in old coal towns and labor movement museums, when people speak the name Candle Sisters, they don't whisper, they speak it with reverence, because the fire that consumed them wasn't just the end of a tragedy. It was the beginning of a movement. In Ember Hollow, factories weren't just buildings, they were beasts. Smokestacks didn't just cough black clouds, they roared with hunger, and the hungriest of them all was the Thornhill textile mill, the place where the Candle sisters worked, the place that chewed up bodies and spat out silence. It looked like a fortress from the outside, stone walls, metal gates, and barred windows, but what happened inside was far more disturbing than anything its grim exterior suggested. People used to joke that once you walked through the Thornhill gates, you left your soul behind. They weren't wrong. Shift bells rang before dawn, and the doors locked behind the workers. There were no fire escapes, no safety protocols, and certainly no rights. Girls as young as 8 were made to stand for 12 to 16 hours, their tiny hands stitching until they bled. Breaks were rare, accidents were frequent. Supervisors patrolled like guards, wielding sticks and belts, not to guide, but to punish. The factory operated under a strict rule: productivity over people. Every second counted. If you slowed down, you were docked pay. If you spoke, you were silenced with a backhand or worse. If you fainted, your body was dragged to the back room until you woke up, or didn't. There was a corner of the factory the girls called the bone locker. That's where injured workers were tossed, often left untreated for hours. Some never returned from it. The machinery was old and temperamental, sharp-edged wheels spinning faster than the eye could follow, iron rods that snapped without warning, and belts that ripped out hair or fingers if you leaned too close. It wasn't a workplace, it was a slaughterhouse disguised as progress. The Candle sisters knew this firsthand. Miriam had once seen a 12-year-old girl named Clara lose 2 fingers to a defective loom. The manager told her to return to work the next day, wrapped in rags and still bleeding. Elsie once cradled a younger boy who was crushed by a bundle cart. His body convulsed in her arms while adults walked past, unmoved, eyes locked on their quotas. There were no reports filed, no names remembered, just another shift, just another sacrifice. But what Thornhill didn't account for, what no machine could anticipate, was that 2 of its smallest workers were also its sharpest observers. The Candle sisters began writing down names, times, and injuries. They collected torn uniforms soaked in blood. They sketched out the factory layout, the unsafe wiring, the locked emergency exits, and the places where coal dust built up so heavily it became a fire hazard. These were not just diary entries, they were evidence, and it wasn't just physical pain the factory caused, it crushed dignity. Girls were frequently harassed. Some were lured by supervisors into back rooms with promises of shorter shifts or extra food, only to return broken and ashamed. No one dared speak of it until Miriam and Elsie started gathering whispered testimonies. They never accused names aloud, but they wrote everything down in a red notebook they kept hidden under the floorboard of their shack. Every shift, every injury, every disappearance, it was all there. Thornhill was more than a factory. It was a machine that ran on silence. But when the Candle sisters lit their symbolic flame, they weren't just offering warmth. They were threatening to ignite truth in a town that preferred darkness. One day, a fire did break out, not a symbolic one, a real, raging inferno that consumed the western wing of the factory. Rumors swirled that it had started from a faulty wire, one of many that Miriam had already documented. The emergency doors were bolted shut, just like she'd written. Girls screamed as they clawed at the metal, smoke swallowing them whole. The few who escaped ran half naked into the streets, hair singed and lungs filled with soot. The fire department came too late. Bodies were found curled up behind broken machinery, and the red notebook, it survived, charred but legible, clutched in Miriam's hand. The sisters didn't make it out. But the truth did. The red notebook became evidence in a case that would spark one of Pennsylvania's earliest labor reform movements. Photos of the burned children, sketches of the unsafe factory, and first-hand accounts of abuse were published in underground papers and later picked up by larger publications. The public was outraged. Thornhill Mill was shut down, factory owners were fined. New regulations were passed across several counties, mandating minimum safety standards, worker protections, and the legal right for minors to attend school instead of sweatshops. The factory that had once fed on flesh was finally starved of silence, and though the Candle sisters perished in the blaze, their names lived on as the ones who exposed the beast from the inside. It started like every other morning in Ember Hollow, cold, gray, and silent. The sky hung heavy over the Thornhill textile mill, and the chimneys exhaled their usual smog into the dawn. The workers, mostly girls, some no older than 10, filed through the rusted iron gates like shadows, their eyes dulled by routine. But that day was different, even if no one knew it yet. That was the day the air itself felt, waiting. Inside the mill, the machinery groaned to life, grinding and clanking like a beast roused from slumber. The smell of oil, sweat, and coal dust clung to every surface. The wooden floors were slick with grease. The emergency exits, like always, were locked from the outside, and the fire buckets that lined the walls. They hadn't seen fresh water in years. It was a matchbox waiting for a single spark, and it came at precisely 2:47 p.m. near the western wing of the spinning room. A faulty wire, long reported but never repaired, gave way. It wasn't a loud explosion, just a flicker, a snap, and then an ember that danced its way into a mound of cotton. Within seconds, the flame fed on the dry lint like it was starved. It moved fast, too fast. One of the younger girls screamed. Others ran toward the back door, only to find it bolted shut as it always was. Panic swelled. The machines kept running. No one knew whether to keep working or flee. Managers barked orders that made no sense. In the chaos, a cart overturned, blocking one of the narrow walkways. Girls tripped, piled atop one another, and the fire kept growing, reaching for the ceiling beams and cascading down like a fiery waterfall. The smoke wasn't like smoke from a fireplace. It was thick, black, choking, searing the lungs before the flames even touched the skin. Some tried to crawl, some covered their faces with rags, but the air turned toxic. Visibility dropped to zero. In one corner, the Candle sisters, Miriam and Elsie, tried to lead a group of younger girls through a side corridor. Miriam carried a child on her back. Elsie pulled another by the hand. They reached a locked window. The glass was thick and rusted into its frame. Elsie tried to smash it with a sewing stool, but the stool broke instead. The fire came around the corner like a predator, forcing them to huddle together. Witnesses later said they heard singing. In the middle of all that terror, someone was humming an old lullaby, soft, shaky, defiant, a sound that didn't belong and yet somehow did. They said it was the Candle sisters calming the little ones, giving them one last moment of peace before the fire claimed them. But the flames didn't just take lives, they took truths. For years, Thornhill had operated under the illusion of progress and prosperity, but that day exposed the rot underneath. The fire tore through walls and floorboards, revealing the corners that had hidden complaints, covered abuse, and silenced the injured. It burned away the lies. It cried out with a fury that couldn't be ignored. The town heard those cries, and this time they listened. Outside the factory, the streets filled with onlookers. Parents, townspeople, laborers from other mills. They watched in horror as black smoke curled into the sky like a funeral shroud. They saw the desperation of the workers trying to claw their way out. They heard the pounding on metal doors, and they saw something else, the cost of silence. It was on that day that mothers who had long feared for their daughters finally stepped forward. It was that day that fathers, once too proud or too poor to protest, demanded answers. And it was the day that reporters, drawn by the scale of the disaster, arrived with notepads, cameras, and uncomfortable questions. The fire killed 48 workers, nearly all of them under 16. Many were never identified, two burned, two broken. But among the rubble, a fireproof locker was discovered. Inside it, soaked in soot but untouched by flame, was the Candle sisters' red notebook. Names, dates, injuries, abuses, drawings of the factory's unsafe conditions, notes about the backroom deals, even a letter to a labor board official. Never mailed, that notebook became a relic, a weapon, and a voice for the voiceless. The day the flames cried wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. It was the day that Ember Hollow stopped pretending, the day when whispers became demands, when mourning turned to movement. In the aftermath, factory reform laws swept through the region. Safety codes were rewritten, inspections became mandatory, and most importantly, the story of what happened inside Thornhill Mill was printed in bold letters across the state, ensuring the world couldn't look away. The fire cried, and everyone heard it. In the quiet valley town of Dunstow, where the morning fog curled through cobbled streets like a memory refusing to fade, there stood a ruin long avoided by the living. The old Greywick orphanage, burned to the bones 20 years ago, was more than a building. It was a scar, the kind people stopped talking about, not because they forgot, but because remembering hurt too much. The ashes still remained, scattered in the cracks of brick and blackened wood. Even after the cleanup crews came and left, they swept the floors, bulldozed the walls, replaced the fencing, but nothing could touch the weight that still hung in the air. It was as though the fire never really ended. It had burned its way into the soul of the town. On the surface, Greywick's tragedy was labeled an accident. The official report said it started in the furnace room. A neglected boiler, faulty wiring. But those who knew the children who worked there, who once lived in that cold, echoing place, they whispered another truth. That place wasn't just physically neglected. It was emotionally abandoned, forgotten by the state, disregarded by churches, ignored by neighbors who chose not to ask why the lights stayed on past midnight, or why some children flinched at every raised voice. 21 children died that night, and 5 staff members. But it wasn't just lives that were lost, it was accountability. The director disappeared 3 days before the fire. Financial records were accidentally destroyed. Emergency exits were nailed shut, and fire drills had never been held. The town knew, deep down, that something had gone very wrong, and so the ashes refused to rest. One woman, Eleanor March, had survived. She was 17 at the time of the fire and had been in the attic, sneaking food to a younger boy named Callum, who had been locked away for misbehavior. When the flames spread, she broke the window and lowered him down using bed sheets. She jumped last, breaking her leg but surviving. Callum didn't make it. The smoke had taken him before he reached the street. Eleanor never spoke publicly about that night, not until her 30s, and when she did, it was not with bitterness, but with purpose. She returned to Dunstow, stood in front of the overgrown ruins of Greywick, and said the words that cracked the silence like thunder. There are still names we haven't spoken, and stories we haven't told. That is why the ashes will not rest. Her speech ignited something that the fire hadn't destroyed. Conscience. Former residents, once scattered across the country, began writing letters. Some returned. Others sent documents, photographs, scribbled journals. They told of cruel punishments, starvation, locked rooms, and nights spent crying into pillows while the staff drank in the hall. The town's mayor tried to dismiss Eleanor's claims at first, said she was grieving and confused. But Eleanor had more than words. She had Callum's drawing, one she had rescued from the attic floor before jumping. It showed the boiler room with scribbled red X's where cracks leaked smoke, and it had a date, 3 weeks before the fire. A child had seen what the inspectors never reported. That drawing became the first piece of evidence that something had been known and ignored. Soon after the media arrived, the state reopened the investigation. Eleanor's courage, quiet and unwavering, made others brave. A maintenance worker confessed that he had warned the director. A nurse admitted she was told to keep certain injuries off the books. A former inspector claimed his report had been altered before being archived. And then came the breakthrough. A burned lockbox unearthed during excavation contained photocopies of complaints sent anonymously, never followed up, never answered. The evidence was no longer whispers. It was paper, ink, and scars. As the truth poured out, so did change. New child safety legislation passed in the region. The town declared March 3rd, the day of the fire, as a public day of remembrance. But Eleanor refused to let the story end there. She built something on those ashes, not a monument, not a museum, but a garden. Every tree planted in the soil where Greywick once stood bore a name, not just of those who died, but of every child who survived that place and carried the weight of silence for too long. People came. They sat on benches, read plaques, and wept not just for the children, but for the years the world looked away. And under every tree, Eleanor had placed one sentence: "We will speak so the ashes may sleep." To this day, the air around the garden feels different, not heavy like before, but sacred, as if the ground remembers. As if the children are listening, because some fires never go out, not until the truth is told, not until the names are spoken, not until justice is louder than fear, and that's why the ashes could not rest, until the people stood up. The tragedy of the Candle Sisters did not end with their final screams echoing through the walls of the old Vire, the textile mill. It did not end when the last ember died out, nor when the local authorities tried to sweep the ashes of their lives under the rug of accidental death. In fact, that's precisely where the story began. Margaret and Eliza Candle were not the kind of girls history tends to remember. Orphaned young, raised in a town where poverty was inherited, not escaped. Their lives were stitched into the seams of shirts and dresses they would never afford to wear. Girls like them were expected to work, stay quiet, and fade. But what made the Candle Sisters unforgettable was not how they died. It was what their death ignited. After the fire, the town tried to move on quickly. The newspapers called it a misfortune, a tragic industrial mishap. But there were too many unanswered questions. Why had the fire doors been locked from the outside? Why were flammable chemicals stored near their workstations? And why were only Margaret and Eliza working that night, while the factory supervisor had gone on leave? What authorities tried to suppress, the people began to whisper. Those whispers turned into voices, and voices into protest. A local teacher, Marian Holloway, who had taught the sisters when they were just children with threadbare shoes and wide, questioning eyes, refused to be silent. She organized candlelight vigils outside the factory ruins every week. What started with 6 women grew to hundreds, then thousands. Workers, mothers, laborers, pastors, even students. Their rallying cry was simple, devastating, and unforgettable. We are all the Candle Sisters. This wasn't just about 2 girls anymore. This was about every worker who'd been underpaid, overworked, and ignored. This was about factories that consumed human lives as fuel for profit. About little girls who lost their fingers to machines while rich men raised champagne toasts to productivity. The story of the Candle Sisters was a matchstick. What followed was an inferno. The town of Virta became a symbol and soon a battlefield. The protests caught national attention. Journalists arrived. Cameras rolled. Activists dug deeper, and when one former factory employee revealed that the Candle Sisters had filed a formal complaint just 2 weeks before the fire, documenting safety violations that went ignored, it cracked everything open. Their martyrdom wasn't an accident. It was the result of silence, greed, and a system that saw poor girls as disposable. Union leaders took up their names. A textile workers' union was formed in their honor, the Candle Workers Alliance. Women who had never spoken in public began leading marches. Elderly mill workers told their stories for the first time. A 14-year-old boy named Thomas, who had once watched Eliza bandage his cut hand during a shift, wrote a poem that went viral. They burned not just from fire, but from a world that didn't care. Now from their ash we build a stair upward, loud, a righteous flare. Politicians could no longer ignore the movement. Policies changed. Fire safety laws were rewritten. Factory inspections became routine and enforceable by law. But more than legal reform, there was cultural reform. People began asking questions, demanding dignity, insisting that profit must never cost a person's life. But the deepest part of the story is this: the Candle Sisters never asked to be remembered. They just wanted to live. To earn a wage, to help their ailing grandmother buy medicine, to laugh after work and maybe, one day, leave the town that had hemmed them in like a straight stitch. They wanted what every human being deserves, a chance. And when that chance was stolen, the world finally saw the price of apathy. The movement didn't just honor their death, it vindicated their existence. Margaret's favorite book, found under a scorched locker, was a collection of poetry. Eliza kept a sketch of a house with a garden she hoped to own one day. These fragments of humanity, once hidden in pockets and lockers, became symbols of what was lost, and what must never be lost again. Every July 11th, on the anniversary of the fire, people across the country light 2 candles, one for Margaret, one for Eliza, not as a ritual of grief, but as a pledge that no worker will ever be forgotten. That no silence will bury injustice, that no flame, no matter how cruel, can destroy the light that comes from truth, dignity, and remembrance. Their story became a spark, their suffering became a sermon, and their ashes, they became the soil in which a movement was born. The Candle Sisters were not just victims, they were the beginning of a revolution. Some stories fade with time. They dim, distort, or disappear altogether, swallowed by the relentless march of history. But not the story of the Candle Sisters. Decades after the fire that took their lives, Margaret and Eliza Candle continue to flicker in the minds and hearts of people across generations, not just as tragic figures, but as symbols of resistance, courage, and the quiet power of unbreakable spirit. Why does their story still burn so brightly? It's because they were not extraordinary in the way we often define heroes. They were ordinary girls with tired hands and soft dreams who found themselves standing in the face of something far greater than them: corruption, exploitation, and the cruel machinery of industrial greed. And still they stood. They didn't raise banners or start riots. They documented, they spoke up, they refused to be quiet. Their strength lay not in loud rebellion, but in their quiet refusal to be invisible. Their story still resonates because it's not just about them. It's about us. Every person who has ever worked long hours for little pay. Every woman who has felt unsafe but stayed silent to keep her job. Every child forced to grow up too fast because life didn't offer them softness. Every whistleblower, every worker, every person who has dared to say, "This is wrong." In a world that rewards silence, they are the continuation of the Candle Sisters' flame. The fire that killed them was real, yes, but even more dangerous was the systemic fire that smoldered beneath their everyday reality: unchecked power, economic disparity, and the belief that some lives simply matter less. It's why their names are still spoken in union halls, classrooms, and candlelight vigils. It's why young activists wear pins engraved with two small flames representing Margaret and Eliza, because remembering them is not just a nod to the past, it's a warning to the present. What we fail to protect, we risk losing again. In a world where stories come and go by the second, it's rare for something to endure. And yet, the Candle Sisters' legacy has not only endured, it has grown. Documentaries have been made, plays have been written, workers' rights organizations have adopted their name. More importantly, policies have changed in their wake, and communities have risen with a deeper sense of accountability. But their story still burns because it teaches us something even deeper: how to grieve with purpose. Margaret and Eliza did not live to see the world wake up, but their deaths weren't in vain. Their suffering became the soil in which countless acts of courage and justice were planted. Their tragedy was not romanticized, it was mobilized, and that's a lesson for every generation. When we are met with darkness, it is easy to feel powerless, to think, "What can I possibly do?" But the Candle Sisters remind us that even two young girls, poor and forgotten by most, could leave a mark so bright it would shine decades into the future. They were not powerful, but they were brave. And sometimes that's more than enough. The brightness of their story comes from the way it touches people. A teenage girl studying labor law finds her voice after reading about them. A former factory worker testifies in court, holding their picture in his hand. A journalist exposes corruption, saying, "I couldn't forget the Candle Sisters." In this way, their story is not trapped in time. It is living, active, powerful, and maybe that's the greatest honor they could have ever received. They were born in silence, lived in struggle, and died in fire, but their names now live in every conversation about fairness, dignity, and the right to safety. Their memory lights a path for the voiceless. And when we feel tired, discouraged, or small in the face of injustice, we look to them and remember, even the smallest flame can set the world on fire. That is why their story still burns bright, because it belongs to all of us.